Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric, continuing series, The History of the Dead, where I take a look at every single House of the Dead game, talk about the history of its development in a retrospective fashion, and tie the whole story together. And today, if you can count to 3, we're going to be on House of the Dead 3, because there's a lot of story tie-ins to this game, and based on the chronological order of this series, this is the last moment in time in the story as of yet. And you will see there, Dan Taylor is with our friend G, and if that name doesn't sound familiar, I will tell you why it should sound familiar shortly. But this is just an absolutely amazing game that has so many story links, and even though Dan has never been confirmed to be James's brother or sibling, it makes a little bit of sense that he's related to at least one of the Taylors. They didn't just choose these names for nothing after all. But it's such a fun time to play this game because it feels like the last in the mainline entries of House of the Dead as we used to remember them, because this still has all the gore, all the exploding limbs and holes in torsos that House of the Dead 4 and Scarlet Dawn would unfortunately remove from the formula. But from a story perspective, it is quite important as well, because this is the last bit of story we have of the series at the time of the recording. Even though Scarlet Dawn is a much later game, as is 4, based on these story beats, this takes place last in the House of the Dead universe, and basically it's retelling the story of how Dr. Kurian got his start in this entire affair. His son Daniel was sick, he was a doctor, and he wanted to, as he said, step into forbidden territory to save his life. So that is the inciting incident for the entire House of the Dead series. Dr. Kurian was not starting out evil, he was put in a place in which he had to choose evil or the life of his son, and he went in the evil direction. And in the House of the Dead universe, this is basically an apocalyptic setting where most of humanity is gone and everything is in ruins. And it's a really interesting look. You will see visually this is of a time and place where brown, drab graphics, the Call of Duty look, was quite popular, but it does work for the post-apocalyptic setting it is going for. And I will say it's all of the House of the Dead action you know and love, except it's a little bit more modern than House of the Dead or House of the Dead 2. But I still have to give it major credit for sticking with the gore effects. I love shooting off limbs, I love blowing holes in torsos, and this is the last true game to give that to us in its full effect. Like that hole right there in that fat zombie's undulating belly just looks absolutely incredible, that spray pattern. I just can't get enough of that. But again, this is just an absolute masterpiece from Sega, and it's going to be really fun throughout the video to tie the story of other games together, games that came before it and information that came after it in other games. But again, it's not a House of the Dead game without great bosses, and they're absolutely on point here. I will say the Wheel of Fate might not be my favorite final boss of all time, but Death here playing the security guard cop is absolutely amazing. He's got this club just coated in skulls, obviously his kills, with this big chain bandolier over his chest, and he's going to be chasing you for basically 2/3 of the game. But in the story, we're going to this research facility that Dr. Kurian had used at one point in time because we're trying to investigate what is happening. The game doesn't preface you with a lot of story up front, you get it throughout the gameplay itself, but if you've never played any House of the Dead game, I really wouldn't recommend starting with 3 because you're going to have basically no idea what the story is talking about. Sega did take great care to give their fans continuing story throughout the series, drip feeding you little bits of information, and they structured it in a way in which if you hadn't played the first 2 games up to this point in time, you might not 100% understand what's going on. And I have some ideas about doing a video called The Chronology of the Dead, where I lay out the story in a chronological fashion in one video, so if you want to see that, leave me a comment down below and tell me. Because basically in this story, the woman on the left is Lisa Rogan from the original House of the Dead's father, and that is his partner G, and they really do hint at that in the story as well. She's asking, was her father always involved in missions like this? And you get to know that sometimes her father barely survived by the skin of his teeth, and she asks, what do you think he did for a living? Well, in fact, he did this, driving up into his car in front of the Kurian mansion to kick off the entire series. And the great part about the House of the Dead is all of the characters are so interrelated, and I will say some of the dialogue in the cutscenes is hilarious, but it gives you some great story, so go ahead and listen for 35 seconds and I'll be right back.
Gee, what happened to the world?
The 1998 Kurian Mansion case happened, I suppose. The project was a threat to humanity itself. Your father and I put a stop to it, though.
And it's the first House of the Dead game with solid voice acting, and it's always harkening back to the original House of the Dead and tying in events from previous games. Although I will say, the House of the Dead 2 doesn't really see much of story action in this game. It all is about the original. But again, even though it is brown and drab, I can't say enough how much I like the look of this game. This derelict research facility, all of that mold and rust on the ground, having new enemies as well as old, it just looks incredible. Whether you play it on the Wii or the Xbox, you're going to have an absolute blast of a time. And this is the first game where that rescue your partner mechanic comes into play, because that shows up a ton in 4. But again, just these zombies sitting around a table eating a pile that looks like effluence. It's such an interesting look, and I always love the visuals of this game. But I will say it took me a while to fall in love with House of the Dead 3. I bought this new after playing it in arcades, and I had a lot of fun in the arcade. But when I brought it home, for some reason, it just wasn't clicking with me as much as I wanted it to compared to the first 2 games. But over time, as I played this more, I become way more intrigued with the overall game, especially when you get the story from 4 Special and Scarlet Dawn in the mix. You learn more about how the events of this game unfold, because you do have to play later games in the series to fully understand what's going on with 3. And that's the most fun part, is you can play them in the chronological order, or you can play them in the numerical order and have completely different experiences, but it is an absolute blast either way you decide to play it. And this is just more classic Sega arcade light gun action, a genre in which they were absolutely incredible at. They've made some of the best light gun games of all time, and they continue to make amazing games in arcades in 2023. But this was a great era for them, even though the Dreamcast and the Naomi were no longer on the market and they had pivoted to different arcade hardware. It was still the Sega we all know and love, and they just had a lot of fun with this game, it seems. These monkeys in bandages in cages, these fat dudes here with those undulating bellies, things that you couldn't do on previous generations of hardware now show up here. But even some of the bosses are quite inventive. I mean, we have seen spiders, we've seen other animals, things such as that, but we come into this feeding pit and there's bodies hanging from the ceiling, and we wonder what is doing this. What animal would you guess? Sloth was not my first pick, but it's 100% what it is, and as the tarot card says, it is the Fool. But the soundtrack and some of the cutscenes are quite good, so go ahead and listen for like 45-50 seconds. I'll come back and talk more about the history of the dead. Enjoy.
Enough yet?
Daniel, have I stepped outside the bounds of human morality? Most of my researchers have left me.
Definitely get a cheesy joke here and there, but that is Sega. What do you expect from them other than the cheese? And I do love the fact that you get the evolution of Dr. Curion's character. It's so much fun to give him layers and dimensions, and sometimes in these games you're going to see something later you've already seen before. Like tripping this alarm here, if we move over to Scarlet Dawn, they are going to do the exact same thing. The developers at Sega love putting in little nods to previous games and the mechanics or the enemies or the settings, and it's so much fun to be able to watch these all back to back and see things I've never seen before. It is just a ton of fun to notice things that I have never picked up on until I played all of these games in a row in 2 days and started editing them. But our friend Death is back. I told you he's going to be chasing us throughout this entire game, and it's a mechanic that they've never used since. Sure, there will be some boss refights now and again, but there's never been a boss in the House of the Dead that follows you from level to level to fight, and I really enjoy that touch. Just when you think you've escaped, suddenly he bursts through another wall like the zombie Kool-Aid man that he is, and continues to come at you. It's a fun, almost Nemesis style thing from Resident Evil, but it is in the House of the Dead franchise. And I will say, when this game came out, I feel like the House of the Dead's popularity had definitely waned compared to the first 2 releases. I will be hard pressed to find an arcade cabinet for this anywhere near where I live, but I've definitely seen a lot of House of the Dead and House of the Dead 2 cabinets, and a decent amount of House of the Dead 4 and Scarlet Dawns. This is probably the least talked about and least loved game in the series, series, which is quite unfortunate because it's got a ton of fun and a lot of interesting animations, like these commando soldiers coming in from the air ducts above. They didn't need to be as detailed as they were, but it seems like the developers wanted to put as much detail in this game as they possibly could, and they succeeded in so many different ways, and that is why my love for this game has grown a lot over the years, noticing all these small details that I love. And that's what makes a game great, is when they add those little details in to call back to a previous instance that you have played. Sega is great at giving a lot of people a lot of fan service, and House of the Dead 3 does not disappoint in any way, shape, or form in that respect. And that is why it's just so much fun to talk about these things, tying the story together. And we still have a bunch of games to go in the mainline series and so many more details to provide you. I've structured this so that you get just enough to understand the story in each one, and by the time you're watching all of the episodes, you'll have a full understanding of exactly how all of this fits together. And that's a ton of fun because it's just, to me, a great way to talk about the history of Sega and the House of the Dead franchise in and of itself. But death here is relentless, as it is for all of us. None of us will escape him unless you play the House of the Dead 3, and it will be the only time in your life that you manage to escape death. But one more Kool-Aid through the door until we finally take him down. And when you finally do kill him, you have such a sense of accomplishment because he's been absolutely chasing you the entire game, and you finally get away from him. It is incredible. Now, this game loves, like I said earlier, to just talk about things that have previously happened, and they mention some different boss battles that are really impactful in the overall narrative. So go ahead and listen to this little cutscene. It's only like 15 seconds long, and I'll come back and give you a little more history dump. Enjoy.
I found it, Daniel. These genes will change the future. The magician and the wheel of fate.
10 out of 10 evil laugh, but Dr. Kurian was not wrong when he said the magician would change the future, because here is Kurian in the original House of the Dead, the first game in the series, telling our characters that the magician is about ready to wake up, and you're going to see what he does. And that's the fun little nod in House of the Dead 3, is Kurian knows that the magician is going to change the course of the future. He just doesn't know exactly how. His hubris is going to get him in a lot of trouble because the magician is not in the mood to listen to anybody, including his own maker. So once he is finally awoken, he is going to produce this amazing fireball on Model 2 technology, and he is going to kill Kurian right here and right now. And that's why that cutscene is so interesting, because it's basically a nod to the fact that it didn't work out for Kurian. And poor Rogan here, it just gets dragged the entire game by his daughter for not being home enough, but it seems kind of unfair because he was saving the world time and time again, and maybe now that she knows what it's like to have to fight for the fate of humanity, she could give her father like maybe 5 to 10% more grace for having to be out of the house for a while. But that's always something I just thought was funny about the story. She's constantly crapping on her dad, but her dad's saving the world, so maybe she should just give him a little bit of a break. But what's not going to give you a break is the gameplay and action in this game. It is just relentless from start to finish, like any good light gun arcade shooter should be. You don't want time to breathe. You want to go to the next scene, see what's happening next, and get excited for it. And it is just always like this. Even this lab here kind of looks a little bit like Kurian's lab in the House of the Dead, because don't forget, this was his research facility, and I would assume he probably hired similar interior designers to get his decor in order. Of course, it's a facility, not a mansion, but you can still have that green and red color scheme if that's the type of thing that you know and love. And considering that a lot of the game has been that brown drab color, it is nice to get inside and get a little bit more color. But another boss, and I absolutely love this one, definitely reminds me of Resident Evil, and there's always these little tones of this game in Resident Evil that seem to kind of mix and match generationally, and I'm sure both Capcom and Sega were inspired by each other. But we have the sun here, and later on in this series, the counterpart, the moon, is going to appear. I just always love those tarot cards and which ones they decide to use. It's interesting that they've chosen sun for this one, because while it is a plant and they use photosynthesis, I see absolutely no lights in this room that could possibly sustain life. But obviously, I am not a mad scientist who engineers DNA, so what do I know? And definitely, if that is not an homage to Alien, then I don't know how they would have missed that, because it's got that little alien mouth vibe going on. But again, all of the boss design in House of the Dead 3 is spectacular. It may be my favorite boss design in the entire franchise, to be entirely honest with you. I love all the cheese, though, and that's the thing. You can't take this game too seriously. It is probably the cheesiest in the entire franchise. House of the Dead 1 and 2 played it pretty straight. 4 and Special also play it relatively straight. I would say that Scarlet Dawn has some cheese as well, but House of the Dead 3 is just written like a crappy B movie. But that's kind of the fun, because a lot of zombie movies were crappy B movies that just happen to become, cult classics, things like Dawn of the Dead. Definitely a lot of cheese in that movie, so it works here. But as we go further on into the game, we're going to slowly get the big reveal of who's actually working with everybody. And that is the fun part, because they've kind of been hinting at or showing you characters that may show up. But again, a lot of the people in this game have callbacks to previous entries. So when you actually find out who the person that saved Rogan was in the beginning, it's going to be very interesting. But we're back in the same area where we saw in the beginning of the game. So you do retread a little bit of territory, but it makes perfect sense from a story perspective. And since the story is so important, I'm going to go ahead and give you about 25 seconds of it so you can see who actually saved Rogan in the first place, because it's not who anyone would have thought about. But I will be right back again.
Hang in there, Rogan.
Dad! I knew you were alive!
Lisa, I figured G would bring you here. Wait! G!
Pleased to meet you, Mr. G. My name is Daniel Carrion. Dr. Carrion was my father. I believe you knew him well.
It may be hard to believe, but he's the one who saved my life. He's the only one who can prevent disaster. I have to go.
You can't. You're hurt. I'll go. Gee, take care of Dad for me.
All right. I leave everything in your hands. Remember, Lisa, believe in yourself, no matter what happens.
Believe in yourself. Lisa, I think I finally understand what that really means now.
And there you have it. Daniel Carrion, the son of Dr. Carrion, has been helping your father this entire game. And you have been seeing him in flashbacks, and it basically gives you the entire premise of what kicks off this series. Dr. Carrion was looking for a cure for his son. Obviously, it involved genetic engineering, and along the way, he went mad with power, and as opposed to trying to just save his son, decided to make an army of zombies. Why did he do that? Maybe we'll never know. We don't know up until this point in time. But it is quite an interesting little bit of a mix to have the son of the main villain of the franchise be aiding you in the final fight against the final boss. I do like that little pivot, and it is just a fun thing. And that is basically Dr. Carrion inside of the machine. He is going to be fighting his father. And that's just a fun little twist. It's got some real Star Wars vibes between Luke and Darth Vader. I don't know if that's what they were going for, but it's always reminded me of it. Unfortunately, this boss fight is definitely my least favorite final boss in the entire House of the Dead franchise. I just don't love the design. I don't love that it takes place in almost like a VR setting. And honestly, in spots, it feels slightly cheap. But leave me a comment down below and tell me who your favorite final boss in any House of the Dead is. Because this just doesn't do it for me. The Wheel of Fate just being completely one texture with no color on it. It's definitely a look and it's definitely a vibe. It's just never really struck with me. This feels too sci-fi and futuristic, and I know I'm complaining about that in a series with genetic engineering, but it is just a personal opinion. But in the timeline of the series, this is the last boss fight to ever exist, because we don't know what happens after the storyline of House of the Dead 3. And Scarlet Dawn said the House of the Dead was going to return and the story would continue, but it's quite possible that Sega makes another game in between the events of the House of the Dead and the House of the Dead 3, so it might still not be resolved what happens next. We know that the Earth is basically destroyed, and there is going to be a little bit more story in the back that really hints at future things to come, but until Sega builds something, designs something, and announces it and releases it, we are just left to our own conjecture, which is kind of fun. I'd love to hear comments down below as to where you think the franchise could go next, if you want a game after House of the Dead 3, or if you want something in between, because as Sega fans, we all have firm opinions as to what we might want. But even now, Carrion's saying the world is overpopulated, but the apocalypse happened outside, so how many people does he think is fair for the world to have? Because that doesn't really make contextual sense. Sure, in the first game, it may have had more of a bearing because nothing had happened to the world yet. But at this point in time, I'm really not sure what's going to occur and what his thought process is. And maybe I'm reading too much into it. It is a light gun arcade game, so maybe the story isn't as foundationally important as I would like it to be, but it does still really make me think about what is happening, because I'm always curious in The House of the Dead where this franchise is going to go next. And that's just because I've spent decades playing it and I'm invested in the storyline and what's happening. But let's go to the ending here. And there are more than one, depending on how you perform during the game. But it basically always starts leaving this research facility and Rogan and G talking to each other, because obviously, no pun intended, but there's a big pun intended, they are the OG of the franchise, so it's fun to see them walk off together knowing they are both still fine. But of course, they're talking about what might change or what might stay the same, and that the next generation is going to have to take up that mantle. So if there is another House of the Dead after the storyline of 3, I'm assuming that it's going to involve Rogan's daughter and maybe Daniel Curian, or maybe they'll create an entirely new character, because they do love throwing new characters in the mix while calling back to other characters as well. But the ending to this game really does tie a lot of other games up into it as well, because you'll see here that as we're coming out, Daniel Curian just needs a little bit of a minute, and this is where, depending on your performance, you'll get different endings. I'm going to include one and then a very special second one, but he's talking about the fact that this facility was his entire life and what is happening inside of it. But if humans go down the wrong path again, he'll come back. So it's basically prefacing him to potentially be a villain in a new House of the Dead game that happens after this story. But you will see this limping man coming in and finding the cure that Dr. Curian made. And if you don't remember, there's another man that has a limp in the game that you have not seen yet based on my videos, but maybe have seen as far as actually playing the games, and that is because this is Thornhart, the same villain from House of the Dead Scarlet Dawn. He seemed younger there, so maybe this age in the game is actually just his disease. Short of that, that's House of the Dead 3. It's a hell of a game. We'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.